People who knew murderers, when did you know something was off? I went through primary and high school with a guy in the year below me who seemed a little distant. We lived near each other and caught the bus from the same stop. He was a bit of a bully, but it was something more. Like you could tell he wasn't a bully because he was hurting inside or because he felt threatened in some way. He was a bully because he did what he wanted to do and didn't realize that it hurt other people. Like the kind of kid who enjoyed pulling wings off flies. Not long after I left my hometown, I heard that he had been charged with the murder of a 2-year-old. Apparently his girlfriend at the time left her daughter with him for an hour or so while she ran an errand. He couldn't deal with the toddler crying anymore, so he beat her. He caused severe internal bleeding and she died in hospital not long after. He would have been around 22 when he did it. He was sentenced to 36 years with a non-parole period of 27 years. Edit. When he said there was a teenager, his mother and his stepfather lived around the corner from me. My mother knew them better than myself, but we all thought they were lovely. A couple of years ago, the son went to the hospital several times asking for help. He claimed he had voices telling him to kill his stepfather. But each time he went, he was released and told to come back. They were given an appointment. A few weeks later, during a small argument, he stabbed his stepfather to death in the front garden. He turned himself in the next day and wasn't convicted as he sought help before it happened. Instead, he got the treatment he needed. Edit. I see a lot of people wondering if it might have been a defense-planned murder. It wasn't. The way he was killed and how the son acted after removed any doubt. My ex-co-worker was always a huge dick who nobody liked to work with. He'd always be on his phone and talking to someone, even when he had a customer waiting to order in the drive-thru. The moment I knew he had something wrong with him was when I caught him looking for his dab pen in one of the lockers in the back room. He always used a top locker, but he was searching through one at the bottom, which happened to be my locker for the day. I told him that, so he just stared me in the face for a second and walked away. Later that same year, I learned that he shot and killed someone at a gas station. Edit. To clarify, he was most likely trying to steal from me. I knew a guy who killed his dad with a baseball bat, found not guilty. I met his dad when he came into the bar I worked at. He was a nightmare. He would squeeze people's hands when he shook them. He and his son were both boxers and the dad was really rough with him apparently. Dude, that hand squeezing thing is f***ed up and I've experienced it and truly believe it's the mark of a sadist. I remember one guy doing it to me when I was a little girl and how his eyes gleamed as I yelled and finally managed to grab my hand back. There are a lot of closet weirdos out there. The murderer I know was more of an acquaintance or casual friend. He lived down the hall from me and we hung out sometimes, but not like just the two of us. Still, we chill at each other's place regularly. I passed him one day in the stairwell and I said hi. He said hi back but called me by the wrong name. He was really distracted and kind of awkward. He didn't make eye contact and kept moving. I remember thinking maybe we don't know each other as well as I thought. Later he was playing Nintendo. Yep. My N64. This was a while ago, with my roommate when I came home. He apologized and said his mind was elsewhere. A couple days later there are cops all over the building, interviewing people and searching his place. They'd found the guy's roommate with a bullet in the back of his head in an abandoned lot across town. The next day he confessed. I worked in a food court in my early 20s. This family would come in pretty regularly. The family stuck out because they were giants. Mum was easily 6'1" and dad was 6'7". They had a few kids. Nothing really stuck out at the time. They never seemed happy but never fought. They just always looked like they were just coming out of mourning. I heard a few years back that the mom decided to leave the dad. The dad murdered the whole family and then killed himself. Another co-worker did something similar. He lived with his elderly dad. He was a super nice, but just always had this deep sadness behind his face. His GF broke up with him. His dad's health went south. Everything became too much, so he shot his dad and then himself. Even after hearing that, I felt bad for him. He seemed like a dude with a big heart, and if he just had a day to decompress and someone to talk to, I think it would have gone a lot differently. I didn't. He was the sweetest, kindest, gentle giant kind of guy. Kind of a weirdo, but still a great guy overall. I remember once that he shed a tear just by talking about his kid, because he was so filled with emotion from having him in his life. He turned out to kill his wife, kidnap his child, start the longest Amber Alert in the history of Canada. As he tried escaping to a different province, he killed another man to steal his car. I'm still unsure today if I should have seen anything at any point. It comes to haunt my nightmares from time to time. Had an employee on my work crew. Acted strange and wouldn't listen to direction. Had goofy huge sideburns. Ended up going to jail for a short time. When he got out, he shot his GF and her parents. Stubborns. Looking back, I should have known immediately. But I didn't even know what I was seeing. In 2016, I was working as a server, and one of my co-workers was always complaining about her Thai husband and how they always fought. They were from Chicago, and kind of just always loud and aggressive. So I didn't think much of it. One night, they both came in for dinner and drinks and sat in my section. And I was looking forward to finally meeting her husband so I could give him a face. I just remember not being able to look him in the eye. Feeling super uncomfortable anytime I needed to go over to their table. Because my friend would try to spark converse and I wanted to talk to her also, but the guy's presence just sitting there would make my skin crawl. They left that night, but soon she stopped coming to work, and then, a couple weeks later, news broke about the murder-suicide, husband being the murderer. It was heartbreaking. And I no longer take lightly word of domestic disputes. Never did. Quiet shy lad at school with a small circle of friends. Starting losing his hearing as a teenager and became increasingly frustrated and angry. A minor disagreement in a pub, possibly caused by him not hearing the other guy, turned into a fight and he glassed him. Other guy bled out. One of the smartest, most popular, and friendliest guys at my high school. He stood up for people who got bullied. He included everyone. He helped people who needed it all the time. Seemed like an utterly selfless guy. Literally everybody loved the guy. 2 years ago killed his wife and then himself after an argument. Not my experience, but my grandmother's. She got pregnant at 15 by my grandfather and had to get married, 1960s. He was extremely abusive and my grandmother went to the police multiple times because she felt like he would wind up killing someone. But they just didn't take it seriously and ignored her. He later went on to strangle and beat a 14-year-old girl to death with a baseball bat just a couple years later. Edit. I am editing to include this because I've seen a couple people asking, speculating. But my grandmother did get away from him. They had been separated when this happened, and he was put in prison. But I do know he got out, and from what I was told, it was on insanity. I'm not 100% on the details of his release as he is a pretty taboo topic. But he finally died in 2014. Though I didn't find that out until a year later. I had only ever met him once. And thank you guys for your words. I wasn't expecting this to get the attention it did, so I'm still going through comments. My bio dad ended up murdering my stepmom. Everyone in my family, my mom and 2 older brothers, definitely knew that something was up. He had severe anger issues and was very abusive. Some of the earlier memories I have are of him choking one of my brothers. He even almost choked my mom to death a couple of times. Obviously my mom was smart and divorced him as he didn't want to see him kill my brothers. Years later I come home from school and my mom and stepdad take us all to the side and tell us he shot our stepmom and was currently in jail. None of us were surprised. If anything, I was just so grateful my mom left him. It's so strange that I am directly related to a murderer. Never. He was a seemingly happy kid who brought a backpack full of, probably stolen, SNES games over to my place pretty regularly. The last time I posted this, I said he killed another teen in a drug-related turf war. I looked up his case afterwards and it was actually 2. The first time I met him, Jose was a friend of my ex and something immediately seemed off. He was sneaky. Always lying and cheating, but not good at it cause he was dumb. And a total narcissist as well. I told my ex to keep his distance. That Jose would only get him into some. Not only did he set my ex up to be robbed, Jose snitched on a bunch of other people. And finally snapped on stranger in a fit of roidroid rage and stabbed him. The guy he killed was fairly young and a good kid. Just in the wrong place at the time. I hope that asshole rots in prison. Edited to clear up any confusion. A great uncle shot one of my great great uncles for trying to fondle, or rape, another family member. Turns out everybody was tired of his. So the killing was never reported. Nobody quite knows where the body is buried. But my guess is that he threw it into the river. We were a dictatorship at the time. So seeing bodies flushed down the river was not uncommon. Honestly, this girl I went to school with killed 2 kids she babysat and their mother. But for that, I would have told you she was one of the calmest, coolest people in our school. Would have never suspected her to do something like that. Kid I went to school with from 5th to 8th grade. He was always a dick. Typical class clown but with a mean streak. When we hit middle school he was always making comments about 2 girls that were incredibly inappropriate. I never liked him and hated being around him. He ended up getting into meth and shot his mom and dad in their sleep while high. His mom died and his dad survived but was severely injured. Last I heard he was crying crocodile tears saying he regrets everything and wants another chance. But knowing him, it's total bull. He deserves to rot. Edit. Should probably add he shot his parents when he was in his later years of high school. I only went to school with him from 5th to 8th because I changed schools. The moment he told me that back home in Russia he once shot a guy who kept insulting him. Weirdest wedding party encounter ever, but it seems I'm distantly related to a murderer since around 13 years or so. Well, attempted murderer. He attacked his dad with a hammer. He was one of my best friends growing up. I couldn't see it, but my parents did. They always said something seemed off. I only began to see it in my early 20s. There was just something off behind his eyes. He was very impulsive and keen to take big risks. Last I heard he's in the state mental hospital indefinitely. When he came looking for me because I was the only one that knew of the abandoned mine we both found when exploring as kids. It had been years since we had talked and he suddenly showed up looking for me. He killed his roommate because he was gay and made a pass at him. Dumped the body in the mine in Boulder County, Colorado. A couple. First was the guy who was neighbor to a little girl that went missing. He was visiting the family daily to check on them and volunteered for the search parties. Started to get all shady when they found the body, arped and murdered, and then disappeared from view when they started to suggest DNA testing all males in the area to find out who had done it. The little girl's sister was in my year at high school. And the guy is still in prison. The other incident was 2 brothers. Used to drive around with my brother when he delivered pizzas. Normal kids who one day went home and found their schoolteacher mother had been murdered. Lot of speculation around what had happened as the father was in the pub at the time so couldn't have been him. Anyway, they just kept driving around as normal and weren't upset or bothered at all. Reason being that it was the 2 brothers who had killed her at the dad's urging. And he was in the pub to give himself an alibi. They all ended up in prison. I knew someone when I was in my early 20s in India. He was a dirtbag. But a fun guy under the right circumstances. I made sure to talk with him and be as pleasant as I could. While keeping him at an arm's distance. I moved away and then my mum tells me several years later that he and his 4 brothers were hired killers. Apparently 2 people got into a fight over a property and one of them hired these bunch of thugs. They waited for their victim to get home, get changed and relax. When they exploded an oil can in front of his house. When he came running out to see what was going on, they threw red chili powder in his face to blind him and chopped him to bits with large sickles. Apparently, the body was in multiple pieces at the funeral. I knew the victim as well. Guy had 2 daughters. I'm crazy. Had a friend who, for some reason unknown, stopped taking his medication. I think it was for bipolar schizophrenia. Anyways, he ended up stabbing his mom and little sister to death and drinking their blood. Later, after he had been arrested, they found him eating and drinking his own feces and fluids, babbling about how their menstrual blood sustained him. He got back on medication, and the state said he was mentally fit for trial and they convicted him. I don't even remember for how long. I thought the entire situation was wrong. It's kind of crazy how 1 month you know someone and they're just normal, laughing, and living their life, and the next they're doing something terrible. Looked him up to find the details. He was sentenced to 80 years in prison. He used a carving knife and a fork in the murder. And his sister was only 6 years old. I know too little to judge, of course, but that does not sound like someone who's fit for trial. Not mine, but my wife's story. She attended Columbine HS at the time of the shooting. She said she never could have expected the shooters to do what they did. They were just weird. Not too dissimilar to any other weird kid. But they didn't talk about what they were planning in public. I'm purposely omitting their names. A guy from my school stabbed his grandmother when he was 18 years old. I knew something was off when I found him hiding in a scrub because apparently snipers were chasing him. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia after he committed the murder. A friend of a friend at college used to hang around and smoke cigarettes with us. Never spoke much, and that always made me feel uncomfortable. A few months back his grandfather tried to get him sectioned on a psychiatric ward. They rejected him, stating he wasn't bad enough. My first stitches was from a doctor at a small medical clinic. Few years later he killed his wife. He was really nice when he was sewing my skin back together. Didn't seem like anything was off at all. Although I was 12, so I might have not noticed all the details. Unfortunately, I know a few people who have committed murder. The one I knew was crazy from an early age was a guy we call Biggie in the neighborhood. He was always crazy. He legit thought he served in the deep jungles of Vietnam. He was like 2 when it ended, maybe 5 years ago. He went to some rehabilitation jail for killing a bunch of dogs and they let him out on a day pass. He didn't return and he beat a well-known gay activist to death at a bar that night. He's been released since then and he lives back at his parents' house. I know for a fact he will do this again. Edit. I'm not a doctor or, as someone pointed out, from the future, so I don't know for a fact he will do it again. I hope he doesn't. My neighbor and first sort of boyfriend ended up running over his girlfriend's mother after stealing her money for drugs. He was always a bit controlling and a lot out of control. But as soon as he started doing serious drugs around 17 was when he became a serious concern. He ran away from home and disappeared only for his mom to get a call that he has killed someone. I think it was ruled as manslaughter though, since there wasn't enough evidence that he intended to kill her. Played D&D with a guy on deployment for a few months while I was in the Navy. We hung out in the same group of people. I stopped playing because he kept trying to RP all the female NPC's player characters. When we got back from deployment, the FBI and SIS were pier-side waiting for him. Him and some other guys had RP'd and killed a woman whose husband was on deployment. Also had some friends who tied up an old man who they suspected of molesting one's younger brother when we were teenagers. They tortured him for hours. Then killed him and tried to burn the body. 2 got life. The other turned evidence and only served a few years. Had another guy I was pretty good friends with get arrested by ATF for trying to blow up the car of our local ADA. He bought fake C4 from an undercover agent. They swarmed him while he was pushing the switch. As I write this, I realize I've been close to some really messed up people. Maybe I'm the one who isn't right. I am the survivor of an attempted family annihilation. I didn't like my stepfather from the moment my mother introduced him. Every time I was around him, I was afraid. Just constant dread. My stomach and chest would tighten and I'd feel like I couldn't breathe. He had these blue eyes that looked like something you'd see in a taxidermy animal. No life in them. I didn't tell my mother because I wanted her to be happy. And I was afraid she'd think I was being dramatic and dismiss it if I tried. He started beating us both shortly after moving in. They got married in May of 1996 and he murdered my mother and tried to kill me in January of 98. He's still in prison. He last came up for parole in 2012 and the board was evenly split as to whether to release him or not. I'm pretty sure they'll release him next time he comes up in 2022. A neighbor of mine growing up was, and still is, the nicest guy. But we learned he had shot his dad when he was younger because the dad beat the hell out of his mom repeatedly. My neighbor did his time. Got released and lives a fairly normal life. His family never hated him for it because they knew why he had to do it. Guy I worked with killed the man who paid his sister. Made his own justice. He spent 18 years in prison. Came out quiet but confident. Stern. All work no play. Was shown respect and was never messed with. He was lucky to get the job he had with that record. Knew it. And was set on keeping it. Friend's dad was super creepy. He wouldn't talk to women much and made his wife do all the housework. No one could eat unless he was there and ate first. Turns out he was ARPing and killing girls in his truck while he was hauling goods for a trucking company. No one can give a good estimate how many girls died, but he kept their bloody underwear as trophies. There was at least 30 pairs. Wait. I did know someone in high school who later went on to murder his girlfriend turned wife. He was a bit rough around the edges when I knew him. But I never would have predicted what he ended up doing. Just a horrible tragedy. I knew his wife. And she was a great person unlike him. He didn't deserve her. My godfather strangled his wife because he thought she was cheating when I was a kid. As I was a young lad at that time I couldn't really tell something was off. Coworker was just super narcissistic and was always talking about his childhood in Alaska. He worked in fast food and I was his boss, and one day he asked to go cut ice out of the freezer with a knife. A few years later I heard he killed someone. I still do not know what his motive was, but I definitely wouldn't put it past him. She wouldn't let me meet her new stepfather at first. She never talked about him. I didn't get to come over. I met him once and immediately disliked him. An unstable and disheveled person. She got quiet at school. A few months later he stabbed the family to death. When I first met him, I was 13 and he gave me weird vibes. Something was just off. I avoided him the entire family hangout. At that time he was the boyfriend of my cousin. They later got married and it came out he was abusing her. She went to stay with her mom. He stalked her and killed her in a public parking lot before shooting himself in front of their 3-year-old. A stranger tried to help her and almost lost his life. 2. I pay attention to those vibes now. I have a friend's friend who, you know the drill. They didn't know. They had no idea. Normal day with coworkers. Where's Stephanie? She didn't show up for like 4 days straight. Doesn't matter. Work. Speak with coworkers. Suddenly police bursts in and arrest one of her coworker. Another woman. Who killed Stephanie over work disagreement. Dismembered the body to hide it. And went back to work like nothing happened. She walked out handcuffed and was convicted. I used to know a forensic psychiatrist. He was in his late 80s. Still appeared as expert witness in court. A brilliant, funny man, but in some ways chilling. The most frightening thing he ever told me was, there is normally no difference between a murderer and you. Except that one day, they chose not to ignore the evil thoughts that most of us have. Who knows? One day, when you are angry enough, you might not ignore them either. On discussion, he admitted that there are some people with no empathy, no compassion, total inability to consider any boy except themselves, but he maintained these were by far the minority of murderers. Most were ordinary people who were just pushed beyond normal boundaries.